6 interruptions. One woman. One room holding its breath. The cameras had barely stopped rolling when it became clear this wasn't going to be just another exchange in Washington. It was something different. Something raw, something revealing. Every time Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, Stephen Miller cut across her words, his voice sharp and domineering, the kind of voice that doesn't ask permission to be heard. 1 interruption. 2. 3. By the 4th, the audience could feel their own pulse quickening, frustration building as if the disrespect were personal. By the 6th, silence in the chamber wasn't silence at all. It was tension coiled like a spring, waiting for the snap. Freeze the frame there. A man with a smirk, leaning forward as if to say, I own this stage. A woman steady in her chair, eyes unflinching, hands clasped, carrying the weight of every person who's ever been talked over, brushed aside, or silenced. 6 interruptions and counting. The country watched in real time. Social feeds lit up with disbelief. Comment sections exploded with outrage. How many times is he going to do this? Strangers typed in unison, as though one insult hurled across that room reverberated in living rooms everywhere. It wasn't just political, it was visceral. Miller's arrogance was familiar. The condescension that thrives on noise, on drowning out, on never letting another voice breathe. But what held the audience was not his voice. It was her silence. The patience, the restraint, the knowledge that timing is a weapon, and that the right words at the right moment can pierce louder than 1,000 interruptions. Viewers leaned in. Some shouted at their screens, willing Crockett to strike back. Others whispered prayers that she would hold her ground and deliver what they couldn't. Everyone knew the clash was coming, but no one knew when or how, because this wasn't just about 2 people. This was a stage, a nation, an echo of power and defiance colliding. Miller wanted to show dominance. Crockett was about to show something else entirely. But what she finally said on that 7th turn, no one in that chamber could have predicted. Who is Stephen Miller? To some, he is the dark architect behind some of the most hardline policies in recent American memory. A senior advisor in the Trump White House, Miller's fingerprints are on speeches that turned division into a rallying cry, on immigration crackdowns that split families at borders, on the kind of rhetoric designed to inflame rather than unite. His reputation has always carried the same edge. Unapologetic, cold, dismissive of those who don't fit into his narrow vision of belonging. He built a career not on listening, but on silencing. So when Miller interrupts, it isn't casual. It's calculated. Every cut in, every dismissive tone, every smirk carries history. He treats interruptions as weapons of dominance. Proof that his voice alone deserves to fill the air. It isn't about debate. It's about control. And as the nation watched him slice across Jasmine Crockett's sentences, they weren't just witnessing a clash of personalities. They were watching the replay of a deeper story. Who gets to take up space in America, and who is forced to fight for it? Enter Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman, underestimated by many before she even took her seat. A black woman in a chamber that hasn't always welcomed women like her. Armed not with bluster but with precision. Her style is direct, fearless, often cutting straight to the truth others avoid. Where Miller leans on arrogance, Crockett leans on clarity. She doesn't shout to be heard. She sharpens every word until it cuts on its own. The stakes? They extend far beyond this chamber. To America's progressive, immigrant-friendly, identity-proud audience, this wasn't just an argument about policy or procedure. It was a moment that symbolized 2 opposing visions of the country. On one side, the arrogance of power wielded like a club. On the other, accountability carried with dignity. It was more than interruptions, it was an age-old question. Whose voices matter in America and who gets silenced? This wasn't just about 2 voices colliding. It was about who gets to be heard in America. Those words pulsed through the moment, even if no one spoke them aloud. Crockett wasn't merely defending herself. She was standing in for every immigrant, every woman, every person of color who has ever been told to wait their turn, who has ever been interrupted before their point could be made. The tension was no longer confined to 4 walls. It rippled outward into households, into Twitter threads, into living rooms where families shook their heads in disbelief. Every interruption raised the stakes. Every smirk deepened the wound. Viewers leaned forward, not just invested in what Crockett might say, but in whether her voice could break through the wall of arrogance in front of her. And then came the moment, the next interruption, as inevitable as the last. Miller tried to bulldoze her yet again. But this time, Crockett didn't flinch, she sharpened. To understand why Stephen Miller's behavior in that chamber struck such a nerve, you have to know the man behind the interruptions. Stephen Miller has never been just another political figure. He has long styled himself as the unseen hand, the whisperer in the shadows, the architect of words meant not to heal but to harden. For years, his name has been tied to some of the most incendiary chapters in American politics. He was the voice crafting Trump's most polarizing speeches, words about walls, bans, and caravans that left millions feeling targeted. His imprint was on immigration crackdowns that turned families into headlines, on rhetoric that reduced human lives to numbers and threats. When Miller spoke, it was rarely with compassion. His cadence was sharp, deliberate, dismissive, designed to slice through empathy. He perfected the art of interruption long before Crockett ever sat across from him. To him, silencing wasn't just a tactic, it was a creed. Miller's rise was built on a paradox. In public, he seemed stiff, almost uncomfortable in the limelight. Yet behind the podium or camera, he wielded words like blades. Critics saw a man whose power came not from charisma, but from cruelty dressed as conviction. Supporters hailed him as fearless, uncompromising, unbending. But beneath that veneer, there was always an arrogance, the belief that domination through words was enough to make truth irrelevant. This arrogance had a rhythm. He would lean forward, voice low, eyes narrowed, dismissing opponents with a smirk. He believed interruptions were proof of superiority, a way to mark territory. And he did it everywhere, on talk shows, in press briefings, in debates. Time and again, Miller made himself the loudest voice in the room. Not because his arguments were unshakable, but because he refused to let anyone else finish theirs. That night with Crockett was no exception. To Miller, 6 interruptions weren't 6 acts of disrespect. They were 6 trophies, 6 demonstrations of control. Each time he cut across her words, he looked a little more self-satisfied, as if the chamber itself was his stage and Crockett merely an unwelcome guest. But arrogance always carries a blind spot. It assumes patience is weakness. It mistakes composure for fragility. It never expects the quiet voice to strike back. And Miller never expected Jasmine Crockett. For years, his style had gone unchallenged. Opponents often grew rattled, their composure slipping, their words tangled under the weight of his relentless interruptions. But Crockett was different. She didn't give him what he wanted. She didn't sputter, didn't stumble, didn't lose rhythm. Instead, she absorbed each interruption like a fighter taking blows to the body, measured, deliberate, calculating the moment to counter. By the 6th interruption, Miller's arrogance had peaked. He thought he had won before the exchange was even over. He thought dominance was destiny. What he didn't see was that arrogance has a fatal flaw. It never prepares for the moment someone stands tall and refuses to be bulldozed. And so the stage was set. A man who had built a career drowning out others was about to meet the one person in that chamber who would not be drowned. But arrogance has a fatal flaw. It never expects the one person willing to look it in the eye. To understand the weight of Jasmine Crockett's silence, her patience through 6 interruptions, you have to step back and see the path that brought her here. Crockett didn't arrive in Washington by accident. She is the product of grit, of fights waged in courtrooms and communities where the odds were stacked against her. Long before the cameras ever turned her way, she was learning how to keep her footing in rooms that weren't built for her to stand tall. Born in St. Louis, she was no stranger to watching power tilt away from people who looked like her. Those early years instilled something sharp in her. A sense that justice wasn't given, it had to be demanded, carved out with persistence. She carried that lesson into law school, then into her work as a public defender. Day after day, she stood beside those who couldn't afford their own defense, people who had already been written off. She fought for them with the same clarity she would later bring to Congress. No wasted words, no unnecessary showmanship, only precision. Crockett's reputation grew not because she was loud, but because she was unshakable. In packed courtrooms, intense hearings, she learned the value of waiting, of listening, of striking only when the strike would matter most. Where others stumbled under pressure, she sharpened. Where others grew flustered, she grew calm. Those skills were not just professional, they were survival. By the time she stepped into politics, Crockett carried more than her own ambition. She carried the weight of representation. A black woman in a chamber historically dominated by men, often white, often dismissive. She was underestimated from the start. Whispers in the hallways questioned her readiness. Pundits cast her as another newcomer destined to fade into the background. They didn't see what years in the courtroom had built. A steel spine, a mind trained for battle, and a voice that knew exactly when to rise. Her political rise was fueled by fearlessness. Crockett spoke truths that others avoided. She challenged power directly even when it meant standing alone. And with every challenge, her support grew among those who felt their own struggles echoed in hers. She became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol for those told to stay quiet, for those talked over in meetings, for those treated as if their words were disposable. So when she sat across from Stephen Miller, there was more at stake than a debate. She wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman from Texas. She was every woman who has ever been silenced mid-sentence. Every immigrant dismissed before their story was heard. Every person of color told to wait their turn. She bore those histories with her, not as a burden, but as fuel. And perhaps that's why she endured 6 interruptions without losing her composure. She knew the script. She had lived it in classrooms, in courtrooms, in political chambers. Every interruption was a test. Every smirk a reminder of battles already fought. She knew arrogance when she saw it. She also knew arrogance never prepares for resistance. Her patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. With each interruption, she was winding the clock tighter, waiting for the exact moment when silence would turn into something unforgettable. And so, when Stephen Miller tried to steamroll her 6 times in a row, Crockett's patience had already written the script for his undoing. The chamber was already heavy with tension when the back and forth became impossible to ignore. Stephen Miller leaned in, his voice cutting, determined to drown out Jasmine Crockett before she could complete a single thought. 1 interruption might have seemed like eagerness. 2 could be brushed off as debate. But by the 3rd, the rhythm was unmistakable. He wasn't interested in discussion. He was performing domination. The first interruption was sharp, sudden, catching her mid-sentence. Crockett blinked but didn't flinch. She adjusted, smoothed her tone, carried on. The second came with a smirk, Miller's words overlapping hers like a hammer pounding over melody. The third grew louder, confident, almost triumphant. Around the room, aides and observers shifted in their chairs, some raising eyebrows, others shaking their heads. It wasn't just rudeness. It was ritual. By the 4th interruption, the pattern had hardened into insult. Viewers at home recognized it instantly. This was the same tired playbook, a man trying to claim authority by sheer noise. Crockett paused, allowed him his flourish, then picked up exactly where she left off, refusing to let him own the rhythm. The 5th was sharper, almost desperate, as if Miller couldn't stand that she still held composure. The 6th carried arrogance, his voice spilling over hers as though the outcome were already decided. And yet, through it all, Crockett didn't lose her thread. She didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't give the satisfaction of frustration. Every time he raised his voice, she steadied hers. Every time he pressed harder, she leaned back into calm. Viewers watching felt their own blood rise, their knuckles clench against armrests, their voices shout at screens. Let her finish. But Crockett seemed to absorb their frustration into resolve. The room itself became a study in contrasts. Miller's interruptions were jagged, noisy, suffused with ego. Crockett's responses were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of patience that feels like thunder before a storm. Each pause she allowed him was not surrender, it was calculation. Every breath she took while he trampled her words was another turn of the screw, winding tighter, tighter, waiting for the break. By the time the sixth interruption ended, the tension had become unbearable. Even Miller's allies shifted uncomfortably, sensing that his barrage had tipped from confidence into overreach. And Crockett, eyes steady, hands folded, had given nothing away. She was a coiled spring, waiting. And then came the seventh interruption. But this one would not land the way Miller expected. The one that wasn't an interruption at all, but a turning point. The seventh interruption began like all the others. Miller's voice pushing forward, slicing across Crockett's words with the confidence of a man who had gotten away with it 6 times already. He leaned into the moment, lips curled into that familiar smirk, his cadence fast and insistent, as if the sheer force of his noise could declare victory before she ever spoke. But this time something shifted. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to wrestle his noise into silence. Instead, she stopped. For the first time that night, she gave him the entire floor. And the silence that followed was not weakness. It was the pause before thunder. The room noticed. Staffers glanced at one another, confused. Miller kept speaking, but the energy shifted. His words hung in the air, louder than before, yet somehow empty. When he finally stopped, when his own arrogance gave him no more syllables to spend, Crockett lifted her eyes. And with the calm of a surgeon preparing a single, precise incision, she delivered her line. "Mr. Miller, if interruptions were arguments, you might have made one by now." It was a single sentence, measured and devastating, cutting deeper than any rebuttal could. In that chamber, the effect was instant. Gasps scattered like sparks. Aides who had been scribbling notes froze mid-stroke. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, as though unwilling to miss a flicker of the fallout. Miller's smirk faltered. His mouth twitched as if searching for a comeback, but none came, because in that moment, Crockett had dismantled his entire performance. Not with volume, not with anger, but with surgical precision. She didn't stop there. She let the silence stretch, her words echoing in the stunned chamber. Then she pressed forward, calmly, unshaken. "You've spoken over me 6 times, sir. 6, and yet not once have you addressed the facts. If your goal is to silence me, you've failed. Because America can hear me. They've been waiting to." The air snapped taut. It wasn't just Crockett speaking to Miller. It was Crockett speaking through him, over him, beyond him, to every viewer who had ever felt their voice dismissed. Her gaze never broke. Her voice never wavered. Every word carried the weight of thousands. Miller tried to recover. He shifted in his chair, CL. What happened after Crockett's words left her lips was bigger than any single exchange. It didn't just stop at the chamber walls. It detonated outward, ricocheting through media, politics, and living rooms across America. The clip hit social platforms within minutes. One moment, it was just another congressional hearing buried in C-SPAN feeds. The next, it was everywhere. Twitter feeds ablaze with captions like, "This is how you shut down arrogance," and TikToks looping Crockett's mic drop line over and over, set to triumphant background tracks. Newsrooms scrambled. Some leaned in with admiration, highlighting Crockett's composure under fire. Others tried to downplay it, focusing instead on Miller's policy points. But the headlines told the story. Crockett freezes Miller in his tracks. 6 interruptions, 1 line. The clip you'll be watching all weekend. For Miller, the aftermath was brutal. The interruptions that once made him appear commanding now looked desperate in replay. The smirk that once suggested confidence now read as arrogance. By the time pundits replayed the video in slow motion, pausing on the exact frame his expression cracked, his image was locked in as the man who got dismantled on live camera. But for Crockett, the wave was different. Her line wasn't just a clapback. It became a rallying cry. People who had never heard her name before suddenly knew it, quoting her in posts, putting her words on graphics, even printing them on t-shirts within 24 hours. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was cultural currency. Why? Because that moment struck deeper than a partisan fight. It tapped into something nearly universal. The frustration of being talked over, dismissed, interrupted, silenced. Every teacher who'd been cut off in a meeting, every woman overshadowed at work, every citizen feeling drowned out by the loudest voices in the room. They all saw themselves in her calm defiance. And when she finally answered, it felt like they were answering too. Cable news panels buzzed. One host called it the cleanest takedown I've seen in years. Another warned Miller's allies that interruptions won't save you when the substance isn't there. Late-night comedians seized it instantly, weaving Crockett's line into monologues, while audiences erupted in laughter and applause. Meanwhile, political strategists couldn't ignore the implications. Crockett had gained something rare, viral resonance that translated into credibility. A single line had made her not just a name, but a force. For Miller, the calculation shifted. His strategy of bulldozing wasn't dominance anymore. It was a liability. Even inside the chamber, the ripple effects were visible. Colleagues who had quietly endured interruptions suddenly felt a little braver. Some smirked knowingly when Miller tried his old tricks again in later exchanges, because they'd seen the blueprint. They knew arrogance could be punctured. And perhaps most importantly, the American public felt a sense of release. In a political landscape too often filled with noise and posturing, Crockett's words reminded viewers that clarity still matters. That timing, composure, and truth can pierce through bluster louder than any raised voice. By the end of the week, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a chamber scuffle. It was a cultural shift, a symbolic rebalancing of who gets to own the floor, who gets to speak, and who refuses to be drowned out. Stephen Miller had interrupted 6 times, but Jasmine Crockett had needed only one line. And the shockwaves of that moment weren't fading. They were only beginning. In the days that followed, as the viral storm settled into memory, the meaning of Crockett's words became clear. This wasn't just about a single exchange or the humiliation of one political figure. It was about the enduring power of restraint, dignity, and truth in a landscape too often poisoned by noise. Her 7th line wasn't remembered as a witty comeback. It became a parable. Teachers shared it with their students as an example of how composure dismantles chaos. Parents repeated it at dinner tables, telling their children that sometimes strength isn't in speaking louder, but in choosing the exact right moment to speak at all. Activists wove it into speeches, framing it as a lesson on perseverance against constant interruption and dismissal. The broader truth was impossible to ignore. Crockett's calm dismantling of arrogance revealed a blueprint for civic courage. She hadn't won by matching Miller's aggression. She had won by refusing to play his game. And in doing so, she reminded America of something too often forgotten, that the measure of leadership isn't volume but vision. Because in every corner of the country, people recognized themselves in her silence and her timing. They saw every instance when they'd been talked over, when their ideas had been stolen mid-sentence, when their dignity had been treated as optional. Crockett gave them a moment of recognition, but also a mirror. Proof that their voice mattered, that their patience was not weakness but power waiting for the right moment. And that's why her words resonated beyond politics. They spoke to the immigrant struggling to be heard in a foreign land, to the worker fighting for fairness in a meeting room, to the student raising their hand in a classroom full of louder voices. Crockett showed them all that timing and truth can shatter arrogance in a way shouting never could. Even critics, begrudgingly, admitted the elegance of the moment. For once, the bluster had been met not with chaos, but with clarity. And clarity always outlives noise. As the clips settled into the archive of unforgettable political moments, it carried with it a moral that transcended parties or labels. Interruption is temporary, but truth endures. And when that truth is delivered with dignity, it cuts deeper than any insult ever could. Jasmine Crockett reminded the country of a simple, timeless lesson. The voice that waits, the voice that chooses its moment, the voice that speaks for more than just itself, that is the voice that shapes history. And as America replayed her words again and again, one thing was certain. This wasn't just about shutting Stephen Miller down. It was about lifting something greater up, the enduring belief that dignity will always outlast arrogance. 6 interruptions. One room holding its breath. And one line that changed everything. What Jasmine Crockett showed the nation wasn't just a moment of sharp politics. It was a moment of human truth. The arrogance of endless interruptions collapsed under the weight of composure. And in that instant, she reminded us all that dignity will always cut through noise. This wasn't simply about Stephen Miller. It wasn't simply about one congressional hearing. It was about us, about who gets to be heard, about the patience we carry, about the strength we sometimes forget we hold. Crockett's seventh line wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. And now the responsibility falls to us. If her words resonated with you, if they gave you even a moment of pride or recognition, then don't let this moment fade. Carry it forward. Share it, repeat it, live it. Let her example remind us that every voice, yours included, can find its moment to rise. Because the truth is bigger than the interruptions. The future is louder than the arrogance. And the story isn't over, it's just beginning. If you believe in voices like Crockett's, if you believe dignity deserves the floor, then join us. Subscribe, share, add your voice to the movement. Be part of the community that refuses to be silenced. Because history isn't written by the ones who interrupt. It's written by the ones who endure, who speak with purpose, who refuse to back down. And tonight, as America replays that seventh line, the question is simple. When it's your moment, will you be ready to speak?